Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rob. Let's draw Aela the Huntress. Aela is a character from the game Skyrim by Bethesda Software, and if you're not much of a gamer, you don't have any gamer friends, that means absolutely nothing. But Aela is your generic fantasy female, very muscular, very strong, very not the typical girl that you would see in a video game, which is why I've chosen to paint her this time. Right now, I'm just establishing a basic pose. Nothing too special here. Just trying to come up with something that conveys the feminine aspects of the character, but doesn't betray her overall spirit. She needs to appear strong, so I give her a wide pose, arms out and ready for a fight. But she still has a sort of contrapposto in her pose. Her shoulders are leaned in the opposite direction of her hips. That gives her the sort of beautiful pose that you want, but still has the overall strength of a fighting warrior woman. So right now, I'm just sketching it out, trying to get a basic outline. Notice how my lines are really loose right now, very quick, just getting them down, trying to establish the idea before it disappears. And there, as you can see, I use a quick trick. When you're drawing a billowing cape, it helps to just zoom as far out as you can and get the overall outline slapped down. That way you're not worrying about the small folds and all the crazy little billows and things like that of the cape. You're just getting down the overall impression, the thing that will stick out the most to you. Now there, I wasn't really too happy with the overall composition, so I shrunk her down, moved her up a little bit. I'm trying to keep her head right at that small corner. It's a third of the way in from the left and a third of the way down from the top. That's really just a good compositional rule. You want to try and keep everything aligned with thirds. Not so much dead center, because that makes a drawing feel flat, but if you get them on the thirds, then things feel dynamic and alive, and it's just more pleasing. If you have a SLR of any good quality, you'll find there's going to be a button or some kind of menu option that will say, turn on grid or what have you, and you'll get some kind of crazy looking grid that splits it up into thirds. That's what that's for. It's to get you to align things to these lines. So now here I've come up with a composition that I really like. It's well established. Feeling good about it, so now I'm starting to add in the small details, the little noticeable bits of her armor, shoulder pads that serve no purpose but always appear in armor because it looks cool. I've lined out her weapons and I've put her on a cliff face. Interesting thing about the cliff face, it has that triangular shape because that's the most dramatic, and it echoes the triangular shape of the character against whatever environment she's going to be in. It just creates a subtle arrow pointing up towards Aela. I mean, the cliff could have been anything, could have been a winding road, but you typically want to follow this triangular shape so that it leads the eye up towards Aela. That's why the cliff is so dark, too. It's obviously not going to be flat black and white as it is right now, but I am going to keep it very dark. Now this part proved to be a challenge. I think of myself more as a character artist. I really especially like drawing faces, so to do a face that small was a test. I hesitated a lot on that part because I really wanted to just drive more detail in. And in fact, that's why the original sketches had Aela taking up so much of the page. I really wanted to focus on her features and on the overall face, but compositionally it didn't make much sense. The character is not known for the way she looks. As far as her face goes, she's known more for her overall appearance, the impression that she gives when she walks into a room. So now I'm blocking in the background, filling in clouds. Those really light lines are my perspective lines, because at this point I thought I was going to add in a forest. I decided against it later on, because it distracted from Aela herself. I didn't want a super dense painting. I also didn't want to obfuscate the cloudy background that I'm going to add in here. I mean, if the previous game in the series, Oblivion, was known for its forests, Skyrim was known more for its mountains, and that's what I wanted to emphasize more, so I decided against the trees. So here I'm just trying to create the impression of the mountain ranges that we see in the game, without getting too hung up on details. Normally, even at this distance, there should be subtle shadows and crags and all kinds of detail in the mountain range, but I decided to just let the fog handle that and to let the overall impression of the mountain happen without actually detailing it. Didn't want to put in too much visual noise because we really want to focus on Aela herself. The background is just that, it's background. Now here I'm detailing the clouds to try and give it some dimensionality, because already at this point I feel like the painting is going to be very, very flat. Typically you'd want to have a foreground, a midground, and a background, and really distinct elements on all three to give a painting depth. Whereas here you don't really have that. You have the foreground with Aela and the cliff that she's standing on, and the background, the mountains and the clouds. There's nothing in between. So I'm doing what I can right now to try and alleviate that. Like there, I just blurred the entire background with the Gaussian filter, cleaned up the edges a little bit. That way we have some depth of field blurring, which doesn't really solve the problem of not having a midground, but it at the very least pushes the background even further into the background to de-emphasize it and to bring the attention more toward the foreground. Now here I'm just rendering in the cliff face. I wasn't really settled on what the cliff would be, whether it be rock or dirt, maybe moss covered. I think eventually I settled on just having it be a craggy, rocky cliff face. So you'll see me change colors and tones here a lot before I finally settle on what color I need it to be. But cliff faces are easy, and they're fun because really you're just rendering very basic, harsh geometric shapes with a very simplistic lighting scheme. So now while I sit here and render these forms, it's not really too much to say, we'll take a short break. I've got a musical track for you from Overclocked Remix, which is a video game music remixing website. They're dedicated to, as they put it, the preservation, celebration, and remixing of video game music from the past and present. So I'm going to bring you a song by a remixer who calls himself Mellogear. Good Mellogear Solid pun there. This track is called Whiterun. It's very appropriate. It's a remix of the song Streets of Whiterun, which is in the base game of Skyrim. So we'll take a minute here and enjoy. Okay, so here we go. I filled in a bit more of the character, just basic midtones at this point. Nothing really rendered fully in 3D yet. Right now, really, I'm just trying to establish the overall shape. A lot of the painters that you'll see, digital artists anyway, they'll just go full alla prima. They won't even bother with the sketch. They'll just start putting down actual shapes made of the colors they expect to use, that sort of thing. But I was part of the comic book generation. I think too much in terms of lines to do that effectively, just throw down the overall shape. So for me, a sketch is indispensable. I have to start with it. So a lot of what I paint ends up being really boring to watch because a lot of it is backtracking. A lot of it is filling in areas that other artists may have filled in right from the get-go. It's a shortcoming, but it really just means a little extra time spent. The important thing, though, is that it's comfortable, and I think really that's what you should always do. I mean, yes, it's the best practice to go straight into your fully colored forms, you know, skip the sketch altogether, but if it's not comfortable for you, if it's not something that you do naturally or that comes easily to you, then in no way is it really a best practice, right? It's not a question of efficiency, it's a question of comfort. If you're not working at your most comfortable, then it shows in your final product. It's going to look forced, it's going to look awkward and stilted. So no matter who's giving you the advice, and this really could work for anything, but no matter what the advice is, take it with a grain of salt, because at the end of the day, you have to go with what your gut tells you, what feels right. And for me, doing lines first, before I even start doing actual shape or volume or what have you, just doing the line art feels right to me, so I always do it. Maybe that works for you, maybe that doesn't, but the important thing is you do what works. And here I'm just filling in overall volume, trying to use my hairbrush to save myself a little bit of time rendering fine strands. The reflection on the top of her head, as you can see, I sampled it directly from the background. Now here I'm just filling in details on her belt buckle, cleaning up a little bit of what I've left behind with the sketch. Now it's funny, with her chest you can see that I started doing shading for cleavage and to indicate the overall shape of her breast, but the way her armor is designed, realistically, that wouldn't even show up at all. But I had to try and find a nice happy medium between logical lighting and shadow and something that's flattering, because if I rendered that completely flat, it would have looked terrible. This is actually just a bad thing for anyone to wear in general, especially a woman. I mean, never mind the fact that it's not very protective armor, it just looks horrible. I mean, it's essentially Borat's bikini, but a little bit thicker. It's just weird. No one should be wearing something like that. So I vacillated a little bit back and forth on what I really wanted the shadow to look like there. I think eventually I settle on something lighter than what it is right now. Yep. And I would later just use the reflected light from the sky to give it a more subtle curve, so that at the very least there's some indication of shape. Still not the most flattering thing she could be wearing, but you can't really change the design. Now I'm doing the highlights on her face and sneaking in a little bit of the secondary reflection on her hair. And now I'm just working my way down the figure. Since I've established a pretty good idea of what the lighting is on her head, I'm using that information to inform the rest of the body, and I'm just working my way down. She has a very intricate pattern on her shoulder plates, and so to fill that in, it's kind of an easy trick. You do the highlight shape first, and then based on where your lights are, you fill in the shadow, which is really just a darker color. The actual shade doesn't matter, as long as it's not too dark. As long as it's not darker than, say, the crevices, where the horizontal and vertical planes of the shoulder armor meet, then you're good. And for the fur, just beneath her shoulder plates, I'm using the same techniques that I did with her hair. Same colors, actually, even. So you can see I sampled it straight off. Generally, that's a good idea, to sample your environment for all of your reflected light. Different materials will reflect the environment differently. Generally, the color of the material will affect the color of the light that's reflected off of it. But in practice, I find it easier to just sample the environment, put a little bit on that very lightly on whatever I'm painting, and then sample that and really paint in earnest. Sort of mixing on the thing that you're painting. It gets decent results. Now here I flipped the canvas because I realized I've been working in one direction for too long, and I spotted that her face was lopsided. Krita's warp tool, in all honesty, frightens me, so I elected not to use it for this video. I just simply repainted the parts of the eye that were skewed. Now, seeing the video reflected, or seeing the image reflected, shows me that I didn't really punch up the contrast enough. There's not a wide enough gap between light and dark around her head and shoulders. So before I kept moving down, I decided to backtrack and render out more highlights and to deepen the shadows a little bit. I also realized that she actually has a second set of plates beneath her decorated shoulder plates. I don't know why. Let's just make it even more impractical armor. So I added those in as well. And now, satisfied with the overall rendering that I've done, I'm moving back down the figure. Now for the next few minutes of this video, this is going to be exclusively rendering forms. I'm just going to repeatedly sample lights, paint materials, sample lights, paint materials, punch up shadows, you know, the basic artistic grunt work. So I've got another track for you. This one's also from Overclocked Remix. It's from a remixer, Brandon Strader, and he calls this song Dovahkiin. It's a remix of the song Dragonborn from Skyrim. I think you'll like this one. Alright. That track is super awesome. I really like it. It's a fantastic remix of an already great song. So, thus far, you've seen me render just more forms, more lights and shadows. One special thing that I did do was add a little bit of environmental fogging to separate out a little bit of the background elements from the character itself, and to give the character a little bit more depth. As you can see, I masked out parts of the rock that were too close to the boot, and then I airbrushed in a little bit of the overall environment color, which gave the impression of pushing her leg a little bit further into the background and making her stance feel a little more solid, a little more grounded. Doing the same thing with the sheath of her sword also added more depth, and it pulled the attention away from those areas because they were running a little bit too dark. When you have something super dark against a bright background, you end up drawing attention to it and flattening it out with anything else that is of a similar value. So we had a character who was really, really flat until I pushed those parts of her body back. And now we have a little more dynamism. I mean, we don't have a mid-ground in this painting still, so as a whole it still feels kind of flat, but by blending in a little bit of the background and the environment color into the character, she feels not only a little more ingrained into the scene, but she feels a little more real, a little more three-dimensional. Ah, this sword. I wasn't sure what weapon to give her because, in all honesty, I have played Skyrim with vanilla weapons for maybe 5 minutes. So I really am not sure what there is in terms of weaponry in the base game. I think the sword that I'm actually giving her is the one sword I used the most in Oblivion, which was the previous game in the Elder Scrolls series, for us non-gamer friends out there. I think it's some kind of Dremora blade, I believe. I don't know. We're stretching my memory at this point. But I really remember liking the overall silhouette of the weapon, which is why it's the first thing that sprung to mind when I started sketching this out. I knew for sure that I wanted to give her a really meaty weapon because if I gave her something realistic, those blades are way, way too skinny. And so they would feel kind of underwhelming on this character. Now I added a little bit more of the environment color to the back of her shield for two reasons. One, it was way too flat. It was simply a black spot right next to, you know, this flesh tone, rim-lit characters, and it just didn't look right. And two, it felt very flat when it actually should be receding into the distance, relatively speaking. So I gave it the same treatment that I did with the sheath of her sword and her back leg. I didn't go as strong though, because it's supposed to be closer to the viewer, which is just a general rule of thumb to follow when you're making a scene. The further away something is from the viewer, the more of the environment color it should have, and conversely, the closer something is to the viewer, the less of the environment it should have. It's basically a fogging hack. It's to simulate environmental scattering of light and etc., etc. A bunch of boring stuff. But basically, farther away it is, spray it harder with the airbrush. Now, here I'm rendering katana wrappings on the hilt of her sword because I honestly don't know what the hilts look like in Skyrim. I mean, it could have all been solved by taking 5 seconds on Google Images, but katanas are cool, so yeah. Now that part is what I really like the most about that weapon. That's the part that really made it stick out in my mind. The fact that it looked like I guess, I don't know what they were going for. Maybe it was a flower, maybe it was a flame, I don't know, but the leafy sort of blossoming look to the blade really stuck out to me. I really like that a lot. Now I don't know if those speed fins, or whatever you'd call them, speed holes, vents, whatever, were actually part of the original model. I just thought those sections of the sword were a little too flat. They needed some kind of detailing. Now here I gave it a subtle highlight of the environment color just to make it have that metallic, glistening feel to it. And airbrushed in a little bit of darkness because, I mean, a sword is metal, yes, but unless it's highly polished, which if you're using a sword in the world of Skyrim, it's probably not going to be. It's going to be a foggy, sort of industrial metal type of reflection. So it'll reflect the general silhouette of things in the environment. Like, it'll reflect her, the rocks, things like that, but they'll be very vague reflections. And so that's why I just went with a very simple light and dark airbrush. Now here, with the airbrush, I'm just filling in to try and balance the overall light. I'm simulating bleeding effects into the camera. And here I set the brush to color mode to just paint the war paint she has on her face. Checking my values. And now that I'm pretty happy with it, I've duplicated the painting on a new layer. Gave it a Gaussian blur, and now I'm erasing away parts of that to show the unmodified layer beneath. Now doing that emulates a sort of soft focus camera lens. Makes it feel very cinematic, and it kind of draws the emphasis back to Aela, and specifically to Aela's face, because that's the part that is in the sharpest focus. Now I used a quick shortcut to handle the chainmail on her side guards there. It's a built-in brush in Krita. I'm sure Photoshop has something similar. And now I'm rendering out lens flares. The horizontal J.J. Abrams style kind. I like these a lot. I do this a lot. It's peculiar to me, and I'm sorry. It's just what I do. It's a habit I have to break, I'm sure, but I was raised on 80s movies, so it's going to be hard. And now here I'm just punching up the shadows a little bit on spots that need it. Check my values one more time. Looks good, looks good. Alright, sign it, and we're done, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like it, and if you'd like to see more, please subscribe. If you have ideas for what I could draw, shoot me a line or drop a comment. Thanks for watching.